The hospital room reeked of antiseptic and broken promises, but Jessica Martinez barely noticed as she stared at her crippled husband lying helpless in the bed before her. Daniel Cooper, the man she'd married 3 years ago when he was whole and ambitious, now lay motionless from the waist down after the car accident that had stolen everything, but she felt nothing except the weight of the diamond ring burning in her purse, a gift from his wealthy cousin, Richard Cooper, who owned half the city's real estate empire. She worked as a senior marketing director at Apex Global Industries, the massive corporation that employed 15,000 people across the country. But she had no idea that the company's mysterious billionaire owner, the man whose identity was guarded like a state secret, was the very same broken man she was about to abandon in this sterile room. The divorce papers trembled in her hand as she placed them on the table beside Daniel's bed, but her eyes were already fixed on the future she'd planned with Richard, the man who'd promised her the world while her husband recovered from surgery. She turned toward the door without a word, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum floor, but she couldn't shake the strange calm in Daniel's eyes as he watched her leave, a knowing look that suggested he held secrets far darker than she could imagine. What she didn't know was that Daniel Cooper wasn't just a crippled husband lying helpless in a hospital bed, but the phantom billionaire who'd built Apex Global Industries from nothing, hiding his identity behind layers of corporate shells while he tested the loyalty of everyone in his life. What would happen when she discovered that the company she'd devoted her career to belonged to the man she'd just abandoned? But by then, would it be too late to undo the catastrophic choice she'd made? What would Richard do when he learned that his supposedly poor cousin was actually the source of the Cooper family's recent fortune? But more importantly, what would Daniel do to the woman who'd betrayed him and the cousin who'd stolen her away? The rain hammered against the hospital windows with relentless fury, but Jessica Martinez forced herself to maintain her composure as she walked down the corridor toward room 347. 3 years of marriage had brought her to this moment, but the weight of her decision made each step feel like she was walking through cement. Her reflection in the darkened windows showed a woman transformed. Designer clothes, perfectly styled hair, makeup applied with professional precision, but underneath the polished exterior lived the ghost of the girl who'd married for love instead of money. Daniel Cooper had been different then, but that man no longer existed. The accident 6 months ago had changed everything, but not in the way most people would understand. The car crash that left Daniel paralyzed from the waist down had revealed the cracks in their foundation, but it had also revealed something else, her own capacity for coldness. She'd stayed by his side for 3 months, but every day had felt like a year, every hour like a prison sentence. The medical bills had crushed them, but worse than the financial burden was the suffocating feeling of watching her dreams die alongside her husband's ability to walk. Richard Cooper had appeared like salvation wrapped in an expensive suit, but Jessica had known him long before the accident. He was Daniel's cousin, the successful one, the one who drove luxury cars and owned a penthouse in the city's most exclusive building. He'd always looked at her with interest, but Daniel had been too naive to notice, too trusting to see the predator circling his marriage. The affair had started 4 months ago, but Jessica told herself it wasn't really cheating. Not when her husband couldn't even get out of bed without assistance, not when their marriage had already died in that hospital room. Richard had offered her everything Daniel couldn't: passion, wealth, security, and most importantly, an escape. The engagement ring he'd given her last week sat heavy in her purse, but she hadn't worn it yet, hadn't made the final break that would free her from the guilt that gnawed at her conscience during sleepless nights. But today was the day. Jessica pushed open the door to room 347, but she wasn't prepared for what she found. Daniel sat propped up in bed, his laptop open before him, his fingers flying across the keyboard with an intensity she hadn't seen in months. His legs lay useless beneath the thin hospital blanket, but his eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes that had first captured her heart, burned with a focus that made her hesitate. "You're working." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but she couldn't hide her surprise. Daniel looked up and something flickered across his face. Not pain, not anger, but something else. Something that made her skin prickle with unease. "Just finishing up some business," he said quietly, but his voice carried none of the weakness she'd expected. He closed the laptop and set it aside, his movements deliberate and controlled. "You look nice. Going somewhere special?" The irony wasn't lost on her, but Jessica refused to let guilt derail her plan. She'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times, but now that the moment had arrived, her carefully prepared speech evaporated. Instead, she pulled the envelope from her purse and placed it on the table beside his bed. "Divorce papers," she said flatly, but her hands trembled as she released the envelope. "I've already signed them. Your lawyer can review the terms, but I think you'll find them fair." Daniel's expression didn't change, but he reached for the envelope with steady hands. He didn't open it, didn't scan the contents with desperate eyes or beg her to reconsider. Instead, he simply nodded as if he'd been expecting this exact moment. "Richard," he said softly, but it wasn't a question. Jessica's breath caught, but she refused to look away. "He loves me. He can give me the life I deserve, but more than that, he can actually be there for me. You can't even—" She stopped herself, but the damage was already done. "I can't even walk," Daniel finished for her, but his voice held no bitterness, no accusation. "You're right. I can't give you what you want anymore. Maybe I never could." The admission should have made her feel vindicated, but instead it left her hollow. She'd expected anger, tears, desperate pleas, anything but this calm acceptance. It felt wrong, like walking into a trap she couldn't see. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the words felt empty even as she spoke them. "I tried, Daniel, I really did. But I can't spend the rest of my life as a caretaker. I'm 32 years old. I want children, a real marriage, a partner who can—" "Be a man?" Daniel's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Go ahead, Jessica. Say what you really mean." Her cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "Yes, I need a man who can be a real husband, but you're not that anymore. The accident took that away from both of us." Daniel studied her for a long moment, but his expression remained unreadable. "When's the wedding?" The question caught her off guard, but she answered honestly. 3 months. Richard wants to do it properly. A ceremony at the Grand Belmont. 500 guests, but we're going to wait until after the divorce is finalized." How thoughtful. The sarcasm was subtle, but it was there, threading through his words like poison. "I assume you'll be quitting your job at Apex Global." Jessica frowned, but she couldn't see where this was going. "Actually, no. Richard convinced me to stay. He says it looks good to maintain my career, but honestly, I love my job. I've worked too hard to get where I am to throw it all away." Something flickered in Daniel's eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or maybe satisfaction. "You do love that job, don't you? Senior marketing director, 6-figure salary, corner office. You've built quite a career there." "I have," she agreed, but suspicion crept into her voice. "Why are you asking about this?" Daniel reached for the divorce papers and pulled a pen from the drawer beside his bed. He signed them without reading a single word, but his hand remained steady and sure. "Just curious about what you're giving up versus what you're gaining. It seems like you've calculated everything very carefully." "I'm being practical," Jessica said defensively, but his words had struck a nerve. Someone has to be. Medical bills don't pay themselves, but Richard says he'll help with your ongoing care after we're married. He's not heartless, Daniel. He knows your family." "How generous of him." Daniel handed her the signed papers, but his fingers brushed hers for just a moment, and she felt a jolt of electricity that reminded her of the man he used to be. "I hope you'll be very happy together, Jessica. I really do." The sincerity in his voice made her eyes sting, But she blinked back the tears before they could fall. She wouldn't cry, wouldn't show weakness, wouldn't let guilt poison this new beginning. She stuffed the papers into her purse and turned toward the door, but something made her look back one final time. Daniel had already reopened his laptop, but his profile in the dim light looked different somehow. Stronger, more dangerous, like a wolf wearing sheep's clothing. The thought was ridiculous, but it lodged in her mind and wouldn't let go. "Goodbye, Daniel," she said softly, but he didn't respond, didn't even look up from his screen. Jessica walked out of room 347 and didn't look back, but if she had, she might have seen the smile that crossed Daniel's face as he typed a single message into his laptop. Initiate Phase 2. Richard Cooper's penthouse apartment occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower, but even its floor-to-ceiling windows and panoramic city views couldn't compete with the satisfaction Jessica felt as she stepped inside. This was her life now. Luxury, privilege, power, everything she'd dreamed of when she'd married Daniel, but he'd never been able to provide it. Never been the man she'd thought he would become. "Did you do it?" Richard emerged from the master bedroom wearing silk pajamas that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly physical therapy bills. But Jessica didn't let herself think about that comparison. She held up the signed divorce papers like a trophy, but Richard's smile was predatory as he crossed the room in 3 long strides. He pulled her into his arms, but his kiss was possessive rather than passionate, claiming rather than sharing. Jessica melted into him anyway, but a small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings she refused to hear. "My brave girl," Richard murmured against her neck, but his hands were already pulling at her clothes with practiced efficiency. "I knew you could do it." Daniel was always weak, even before the accident, but especially after. "You deserve so much better than that broken shell of a man." The words should have validated her choice, but instead, they made her stomach twist. "He took it well," she said, but her voice sounded uncertain even to her own ears. "Too well, actually. He didn't fight at all. It was almost like he was expecting it." Richard pulled back, but his expression had shifted from desire to calculation. "What do you mean?" "I don't know." Jessica shook her head, trying to dispel the unease that had followed her from the hospital. "He just seemed different, calm, almost like he had a secret, but that's ridiculous. What could Daniel possibly have that would make him so confident?" "Probably pain medication," Richard said dismissively, but he'd released her and moved toward the bar to pour himself a drink. "The doctors have him on some heavy stuff for the nerve pain. It makes him loopy, but you shouldn't worry about it. Daniel's finished. He has nothing and no one. We're doing him a favor by making sure he has proper care." The rationalization sounded hollow, but Jessica accepted it anyway. She couldn't afford doubt, not now, not when she was so close to everything she'd ever wanted. She crossed to the window and looked out at the city spread below them like a kingdom waiting to be conquered. "When will you tell your family about us?" she asked, but the question carried weight she hadn't intended. Richard's silence stretched too long, but when he finally answered, his tone was carefully controlled. "Soon. Very soon. But there are some business matters I need to settle first, some complications with the family trust that need to be resolved. You understand, don't you? I can't risk my inheritance, but once everything is secured, we'll tell everyone." Jessica turned to face him, but something in his expression made her pause. "What kind of complications?" "Boring legal things," Richard said quickly, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. "My grandfather set up the trust with certain conditions that need to be met before I can access the full amount. It's nothing for you to worry about, but timing is important. We need to be strategic." Red flags waved in Jessica's peripheral vision, but she ignored them. She'd come too far to turn back now, but the conversation reminded her of questions she'd never thought to ask. Richard was wealthy, everyone knew that, but the source of his wealth had always been vague. Real estate, investments, family money, but nothing concrete, nothing specific. "How much are we talking about?" she asked carefully, but Richard's expression hardened. "Enough," he said flatly. "More than enough for both of us to live however we want for the rest of our lives. But Jessica, darling, you need to trust me on this. The less you know about the specifics, the better. These family trusts are complicated, but I have lawyers handling everything." The dismissal stung, but Jessica forced herself to smile. "Of course, I trust you." But did she? The question whispered through her mind like smoke, but she crushed it before it could take root. Richard was her future, her escape, her salvation. Doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. 3 weeks after Jessica delivered the divorce papers, but 2 months before the wedding was scheduled, something shifted at Apex Global Industries. The change was subtle at first. A new urgency in executive meetings, mysterious consultants arriving in expensive suits, hushed conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. But Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening behind closed doors. "Have you heard anything?" her colleague, Patricia Wong, asked during lunch at the trendy bistro across from their office building. Patricia had worked at Apex for 15 years, but even she seemed nervous about the recent changes. "Just rumors," Jessica admitted, but she leaned forward conspiratorially. "Someone said the owner is finally coming out of hiding. Apparently there's going to be a major restructuring, but nobody knows what that means for our departments." Patricia's eyes widened, but her expression was more excited than worried. "I've worked here for 15 years, and I've never even seen a photograph of the real owner. Everyone knows about the board of directors and the executive team, but the actual owner? It's like working for a ghost." Jessica had wondered about this herself, but the mystery had never seemed important until now. Apex Global Industries was a massive corporation with interests in technology, manufacturing, and real estate. The company was worth billions, but its ownership structure was buried under layers of holding companies and trusts. The public face was the CEO, Marcus Bradley, but everyone knew he was just a figurehead. But the real power, the person who made the ultimate decisions, remained hidden. "Do you think it matters?" Jessica asked, but Patricia's expression suggested she was missing something obvious. "Jessica, if the owner is coming out of hiding after all these years, it means something big is about to happen. Companies don't restructure without reason, but more importantly, when billionaires reveal themselves, it's usually because they're about to make moves that will affect everyone. We need to be prepared for anything." The conversation haunted Jessica for the rest of the day, but she tried to focus on her work. She had a major campaign launching in 6 weeks, a complete rebrand for one of Apex's subsidiary companies, but the project had suddenly been put on hold without explanation. Her emails to the executive team went unanswered, but her access to certain files and databases had been restricted. Something was definitely wrong, but Jessica couldn't figure out what. That evening, she mentioned it to Richard, over dinner at an exclusive restaurant where the wine cost more than her old car payment. Richard listened with apparent disinterest, but Jessica noticed how his jaw tightened when she mentioned the restructuring. "It's probably nothing," he said dismissively, but he reached for his wine glass with unnecessary force. "Companies reorganize all the time. You're being paranoid, but I suppose that's understandable, given everything you've been through with Daniel." The mention of her ex-husband felt deliberate, but Jessica couldn't figure out why Richard would bring him up now. They'd barely discussed Daniel since the divorce papers had been filed, but Richard's expression had gone cold and distant. "Have you seen him?" she asked carefully, but Richard's response was sharp and immediate. "Why would I see him? He's nothing to me, but more importantly, he should be nothing to you. You're moving forward, Jessica. Stop looking back." The rebuke stung, but Jessica fell silent. Richard was right. She needed to focus on the future, but something about his reaction felt wrong. They were cousins, supposedly close before the accident, but Richard spoke about Daniel with contempt rather than pity. Later that night, alone in Richard's penthouse while he worked late at his office, Jessica found herself thinking about the man she'd abandoned. She pulled out her phone and, against her better judgment, searched for information about Daniel Cooper's condition. The hospital had discharged him 3 weeks ago, but he'd apparently moved into a rehabilitation facility that specialized in spinal cord injuries. On impulse, she called the facility, but the receptionist's response was unexpected. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't have any patient by that name in our facility." Jessica frowned, but she double-checked the name. "Daniel Cooper? He should have been admitted about 3 weeks ago. Paraplegic spinal cord injury from a car accident. I understand, but we have no record of that patient. Perhaps you have the wrong facility." But Jessica had been copied on all the transfer paperwork. She'd seen the name of the facility, had even helped arrange the transportation. So where was Daniel? A chill ran down her spine, but she told herself she was being ridiculous. There were probably dozens of rehabilitation facilities in the city, but she'd misremembered which one Daniel had chosen. It didn't matter anyway. He wasn't her responsibility anymore, except she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The bomb dropped on a Tuesday morning, but it detonated with the force of a nuclear explosion. Jessica arrived at Apex Global Industries to find the lobby filled with news crews, photographers, and security personnel she'd never seen before. The energy in the building crackled with electricity, but nobody would tell her what was happening. Emergency meeting in the main auditorium. Patricia grabbed her arm as she stepped off the elevator. Every department head, every senior manager, everyone's been summoned, but nobody knows why. The auditorium was packed with hundreds of employees, but the stage remained empty except for a single podium and a massive screen displaying the Apex Global logo. Jessica found a seat near the middle, but her heart pounded with unexplained dread. CEO Marcus Bradley walked onto the stage, but his usual confident swagger had been replaced by visible nervousness. He approached the microphone with obvious reluctance, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. Today marks a historic moment in Apex Global Industries history, but I'll let the man himself explain what's happening. For the first time in the company's 20-year existence, I'm honored to introduce you to the founder, owner, and true visionary behind everything we've built, but I suspect many of you will be shocked by who he really is." The lights dimmed, but a spotlight illuminated a figure emerging from the wings. He moved slowly, deliberately, but there was nothing weak about his presence. The wheelchair gleamed under the stage lights, but the man sitting in it commanded the room with an authority that made Jessica's blood turn to ice. Daniel Cooper rolled onto the stage, but he wasn't the broken, defeated man she'd left in a hospital bed. He wore a custom suit that probably cost more than her car, but more shocking was the transformation in his bearing. This was a man who owned the world, but he'd hidden it so well that even his wife had never suspected the truth. "Good morning." Daniel's voice carried through the auditorium without need for amplification, but every word struck Jessica like a physical blow. "I'm sure many of you are confused right now, but allow me to introduce myself properly. My name is Daniel Cooper, and I founded Apex Global Industries 20 years ago, when I was just 22 years old." The screen behind him flared to life, but the images told a story Jessica had never known. A young Daniel, intense, brilliant, driven, standing in front of his first office. Articles from business journals chronicling the meteoric rise of a mystery entrepreneur who'd revolutionized 3 industries before he turned 30. Patents, acquisitions, innovations, all bearing Daniel's fingerprints, but hidden behind corporate entities with innocuous names. "I built this company from nothing," Daniel continued, but his eyes scanned the crowd with predatory focus. "I sacrificed everything, my privacy, my relationships, my health. but I believed in a vision of creating something that would outlast me. For 20 years, I've hidden my identity, operated from the shadows, tested everyone around me to see who could be trusted, but 6 months ago I decided it was time for a change. Jessica couldn't breathe, but she couldn't look away. This wasn't possible. Daniel had been a mid-level project manager when they'd met, or at least that's what he'd told her, but the evidence on the screen contradicted everything she'd believed about her husband. The car accident that left me paralyzed was not an accident. Daniel's words detonated like bombs, but the auditorium had gone silent as death. It was a deliberate attempt on my life by someone who wanted to take control of this company, but more personally, someone who wanted to destroy me and take everything I'd built, including my wife. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Daniel raised his hand for silence. I survived, but I decided to use my recovery as an opportunity. I wanted to see who would stand by me when I had nothing, who would remain loyal when I appeared weak. But more importantly, I wanted to expose the people who'd betrayed me. And now, 3 months later, I'm ready to reveal what I've learned. The screen changed, but the new image made Jessica's world collapse. Security camera footage from the hospital, clear, damning footage of her and Richard together. Their affair laid bare in high definition. Stolen kisses in the parking garage, whispered conversations in empty hallways, Richard's hand on her thigh as they discussed their future together. But it got worse. The next footage showed Richard in a very different context, meeting with the man who'd caused Daniel's accident, exchanging briefcases, discussing timelines and payments. The audio was crystal clear, but every word Richard spoke revealed the depth of his conspiracy. Once Daniel's dead, the company goes to his next of kin, me. Richard's voice echoed through the auditorium, but the date stamp showed this conversation had taken place 2 weeks before the accident. The will is clear, no children, parents deceased, but I'm the closest living relative. Everything becomes mine, but we need to make sure the accident looks legitimate. Jessica's stomach heaved, but she forced herself to keep watching. The evidence continued. Financial records showing Richard's mounting debts, his desperate attempts to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't afford, his willingness to commit murder for money he didn't have, but thought he would inherit. My cousin Richard Cooper attempted to have me killed. Daniel's voice cut through Jessica's horror, but his expression remained eerily calm. He failed, but in his arrogance, he decided to take something else instead, my wife. He seduced her, promised her the wealth and life she wanted, but he had no intention of delivering. Richard was broke, desperate, living on credit and borrowed time, but he convinced Jessica that he was her salvation. All eyes turned toward Jessica, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't defend herself. The evidence was overwhelming, but more devastating was the realization of how completely she'd been manipulated. Jessica Martinez. Daniel's voice was almost gentle, but his eyes found hers across the crowded room with laser precision. My ex-wife as of 2 weeks ago, but more relevantly, the senior marketing director who's been working for me for 5 years. You asked me once why I never talked about my work, why I kept my professional life separate from our marriage, but I told you I was just a project manager trying to work my way up. You believed me, but you never questioned why we lived so modestly when my salary should have afforded us more. You never wondered why I was always working, always traveling, always busy with meetings I couldn't discuss. But you were too focused on what you didn't have to see, what was right in front of you. The accusation in his words made Jessica flinch, but she couldn't deny the truth. She'd been so consumed by her dissatisfaction, so focused on the life she wanted instead of the life she had, but she'd never looked beneath the surface of the man she'd married. I tested you, Daniel continued, but now his voice carried an edge of steel. I gave you every opportunity to prove your loyalty, to show that you loved me for who I was, rather than what I could give you, but you failed. And now, Jessica, you get to learn a very expensive lesson about what happens when you betray someone who holds all the cards. The screen changed again, but this new image made Jessica's vision blur with tears. Her employment contract with Apex Global Industries, but highlighted in red, were clauses she'd never paid attention to. Non-compete agreements, loyalty clauses, ethics violations that carried severe penalties. As of this morning, Jessica Martinez is no longer employed by Apex Global Industries, Daniel announced, but his tone was businesslike rather than vengeful. Her termination is for cause: engaging in an affair with a family member while married, conspiracy to defraud the company of her husband's rightful position, but most importantly, failure to disclose a conflict of interest that violated her employment agreement. She will receive no severance, no references, but she will be held financially liable for breach of contract in the amount of $2 million. The number hit Jessica like a sledgehammer, but Daniel wasn't finished. As for Richard Cooper, Daniel's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, but the microphone carried it to every corner of the auditorium. My dear cousin who tried to have me killed, who manipulated my wife, who thought he could steal everything I'd built. Richard is currently being arrested on charges of attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence has been turned over to federal prosecutors, but I estimate he'll be spending the next 25 to 30 years in prison. The auditorium exploded with shocked gasps and whispers, but Daniel raised his hand for silence once more. Let this be a lesson to everyone in this company, he said quietly, but his words carried the weight of absolute authority. Loyalty matters, integrity matters. I built Apex Global Industries on the principle that talent and dedication should be rewarded, but betrayal will be punished without mercy. I gave both Jessica and Richard chances to prove themselves, but they chose greed over loyalty, deception over truth. But now they'll pay the price for those choices. Jessica stumbled from her seat, but her legs barely carried her toward the exit. The eyes of hundreds of colleagues followed her retreat, but their expressions ranged from pity to contempt. She'd lost everything: her job, her future, her reputation, but worst of all, she'd lost the one thing she'd never valued until it was gone. Daniel Cooper had been extraordinary all along, but she'd been too blind to see it. The next 72 hours passed in a nightmare blur, but Jessica couldn't wake up from the horror of her new reality. The story had exploded across every news outlet. Billionaire's wife abandons him after attempted murder by cousin, read one headline, but others were far less kind. Her photo appeared on television, on websites, in newspapers, but every story painted her as the villain who'd abandoned her disabled husband for a murderous cousin. The financial devastation was immediate and crushing, but the $2 million judgment from Apex Global was only the beginning. Her apartment, rented with Richard's money, which turned out to be credit card debt and loans he couldn't repay, was seized by creditors. Her car was repossessed, but her bank accounts were frozen pending the civil suit. She had nothing except the clothes on her back and the crushing weight of public shame. But the physical losses paled compared to the emotional destruction, because as she lay alone in a cheap motel room she could barely afford, Jessica finally understood what she'd thrown away. Daniel had been testing her, but not out of cruelty, out of hope. He'd wanted to believe she loved him for who he was, not what he could give her, but she'd proven him wrong at every turn. The modest lifestyle, the simple apartment, the careful budgeting, all of it had been a test she'd failed without even realizing she was being evaluated. And now Richard, the man who'd promised her everything, sat in a federal detention center awaiting trial. The news had revealed the full extent of his crimes: the attempted murder, the fraud, but also a string of other victims he'd manipulated and exploited. Jessica had been just another mark in a long line of women he'd used and discarded, but she'd been too flattered by his attention to see the predator beneath the charm. On the fourth day after the revelation, a lawyer appeared at Jessica's motel room door, but his presence was unexpected rather than threatening. He carried a manila envelope, but his expression was professionally neutral. "Ms. Martinez, I represent Danielle Cooper," the lawyer said without preamble. "My client wanted me to deliver this to you personally." Jessica took the envelope with trembling hands, but she couldn't imagine what else Daniel could possibly take from her. She'd already lost everything, but apparently he wasn't finished destroying her. Inside the envelope were two documents, but the first one made her eyes flood with tears. It was a check for $500,000, but the memo line read, "Settlement in full, for all civil claims." The second document was a letter, but the handwriting was Daniel's, the strong, confident script she'd always admired. "Jessica, I imagine you're confused by this check, but let me be clear, this is not forgiveness and it's not charity. This is me acknowledging that while you made terrible choices, you were also a victim of Richard's manipulation. He lied to you, used you, but ultimately, the responsibility for your actions remains your own. The $2 million judgment stands on the books, but I'm settling it for this amount because I'm not interested in crushing you completely. You were my wife, and despite everything, there were moments of genuine connection between us. But those moments are gone now, destroyed by your choices. This money is your chance to start over, but understand that it comes with conditions. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement that prevents you from profiting from this story in any way. No book deals, no interviews, no movies. You will disappear from the public eye, rebuild your life quietly, but you will never speak my name again except in the context of acknowledging your mistakes. I could have destroyed you completely, but I'm choosing mercy instead. Use this opportunity wisely, Jessica, but know that this is the last kindness you'll ever receive from me. We're done, permanently, irrevocably, completely. One final thing. The reason I revealed everything so publicly wasn't just about justice or revenge, but about sending a message to everyone who works for me and everyone who might think about betraying me in the future. Actions have consequences, but sometimes mercy is more powerful than vengeance. I wish you well, but from a distance that will never be bridged. Jessica clutched the letter to her chest as sobs racked her body. But the tears brought no relief. Daniel had given her a lifeline when he could have watched her drown, but the gesture only highlighted the depth of her loss. She'd had everything, a brilliant, powerful man who'd loved her enough to hide his wealth and test her character, but she'd thrown it away for fool's gold and empty promises. The check would save her from immediate financial ruin, but it couldn't save her from the prison of her own regret. She would spend the rest of her life wondering what could have been if she'd just been patient, if she'd just been loyal, but if she'd just seen the man behind the modest facade. 6 months after the revelation, Apex Global Industries had undergone a complete transformation, but Daniel Cooper had emerged from the shadows as its public face. The company's stock had soared, but investors loved the story of the mysterious billionaire who'd run his empire from behind the scenes before dramatically revealing himself. Daniel had become a media sensation, but he controlled the narrative with the same precision he'd controlled his company. Interviews were rare and carefully managed, but each appearance showcased a man who'd overcome tremendous adversity with grace and strength. His wheelchair became a symbol of resilience rather than weakness, but more importantly, his story became a cautionary tale about loyalty, betrayal, and the price of greed. Richard Cooper's trial had been swift and brutal, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. He'd been convicted on all counts: attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy, but the judge had shown no mercy. 35 years in federal prison, but with eligibility for parole after 25. He was 42 years old. But he would be an old man before he tasted freedom again. From his cell, Richard had tried to reach out to Daniel, but every letter went unanswered. Every attempt at reconciliation rejected. Daniel had drawn a line in the sand, but he'd made it clear that some betrayals could never be forgiven. Family meant nothing when measured against attempted murder, but Richard had learned that lesson too late to save himself. As for Jessica, she'd taken Daniel's money and disappeared, but not from the country, just from the public eye. She'd moved to a small town 3 states away, taken a job as a marketing consultant for a local firm, but she lived quietly, modestly, haunted by the ghosts of her choices. She never married again, but she dated occasionally, though every man she met was inevitably compared to the husband she'd thrown away. None of them measured up, but that was the price she paid for her mistakes. She'd had the best and traded him for worse, but now she lived in the hollow space between what she'd lost and what she could never reclaim. Late at night, when insomnia kept her awake, Jessica would search for news about Daniel Cooper, but each article was a knife to her heart. He'd moved on, rebuilt his life, but he'd done it without her. There were rumors of women, beautiful, accomplished, loyal women who saw him for what he truly was, but Daniel kept his personal life private now, protected by walls she'd helped him build. One article in particular haunted her, but it appeared 8 months after the revelation in a prestigious business magazine. The journalist had somehow convinced Daniel to discuss his marriage, but his words had been chosen with surgical precision. "Do I regret testing my wife?" Daniel had said, his expression thoughtful in the accompanying photo. "No, I regret that she failed the test, but I don't regret giving her the opportunity to prove herself. Some people believe love should be unconditional, but I think true love is demonstrated through loyalty when things are hard, not just when they're easy." Jessica had every chance to show me she loved me for who I was, but instead she showed me she loved what she thought I could give her. That's not love, that's a transaction, but I'm grateful I learned the truth before I wasted any more years on someone who didn't deserve them. The words had been fair but devastating, but Jessica couldn't argue with their accuracy. She had been transactional, had been focused on what she could get rather than what she could give, but the realization had come too late to matter. 2 years after the revelation, but long after Jessica had resigned herself to a life of quiet regret, she received a package at her small apartment. There was no return address, but the handwriting on the label was unfamiliar. Inside was a single item, a small velvet box, but Jessica's hands trembled as she opened it. Her wedding ring sat nestled in the satin lining, but it had been modified. The simple gold band she'd returned to Daniel, along with the divorce papers, now held a single small diamond. Nothing ostentatious, but something meaningful. Tucked beneath the ring was a note in Daniel's handwriting. "Jessica, I had this made for you 2 months before the accident, but I never had the chance to give it to you. I was planning to surprise you on our 3rd anniversary with the truth. About who I really was, about the life we could have together, but about how I'd been testing you not because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain you loved me for the right reasons. The accident changed everything, but not in the way you think. It accelerated my timeline, forced me to make decisions faster than I'd planned. But ultimately, it revealed truths I needed to see. You failed my test, Jessica, but I've spent 2 years thinking about whether the test itself was fair. I've concluded that it was fair, but it was also cruel. I put you in an impossible situation, married to a man who hid his wealth, who made you struggle financially when he could have made life easy, but who wanted to know if you would love him when he had nothing. That's not trust, Jessica. That's manipulation, but I've done a lot of growing in the past 2 years, and I've realized that I share responsibility for what happened between us. This ring represents the life we could have had, but it also represents my acknowledgement that I played a role in destroying that possibility. I wanted to give it to you not as an attempt at reconciliation. That ship has sailed, but as closure for both of us. You're free now, Jessica. Free from the debt, free from the judgment, but most importantly, free free from the guilt I've kept you chained to through my very public revenge. I've had my pound of flesh, but continuing to punish you serves no purpose except feeding my own ego. Move forward with your life. Find someone who loves you for exactly who you are, flaws, mistakes, poor choices and all. But learn from what happened between us. Learn that integrity matters more than comfort, that loyalty is worth more than luxury, but that sometimes the people we think we know are mysteries we never bothered to solve. This is goodbye, Jessica. The real goodbye, not the angry one we had in the hospital, but the mature one we both deserve. I wish you well, but I wish it from a distance we'll maintain for the rest of our lives. Daniel P.S. The diamond is real, by the way. Not huge, not ostentatious, but genuine, just like the love I had for you once was. Keep it or sell it, but know that it represents both what we had and what we lost. Jessica held the ring up to the light, but the small diamond sparkled with a brilliance that seemed impossible for something so modest. It was perfect. Not the flashy rock she'd once dreamed of, but something meaningful and real, but it had come 2 years too late to matter. She could sell it, could use the money to continue rebuilding her life, but something stopped her. Instead, she placed the ring on a chain and wore it around her neck, hidden beneath her clothes where no one could see it, but where she would always feel its weight against her heart. It was her reminder, her punishment, but also her lesson. She'd had everything and thrown it away, but Daniel had given her the rarest of gifts. Not forgiveness, but closure. He'd released her from the prison of his anger, but the prison of her own regret would last forever. That was the real punishment, but it was the one she deserved. 5 years after the revelation that had shattered lives and exposed betrayals, Daniel Cooper sat in his corner office on the 65th floor of the newly completed Apex Global Tower, but his attention was focused on the young woman sitting across from him, rather than the empire spread below his windows. Dr. Sarah Chen wasn't intimidated by his wealth or his reputation, but that was what had attracted him to her in the first place. She was a neuroscientist researching spinal cord regeneration, but more importantly, she'd treated him like a person rather than a checkbook from their first meeting. Their relationship had grown slowly, carefully, but it was built on honesty rather than tests, on trust rather than manipulation. "You're thinking about her again?" Sarah said gently, but there was no jealousy in her voice, only understanding. Daniel smiled, but he didn't deny it. "Just wondering if she kept the ring or sold it." "Does it matter?" "No," he admitted, but he turned his wheelchair to face his fiancée. His real fiancée, the woman who'd seen him at his worst and chosen him anyway. "But I hope she kept it. I hope it reminds her that she's capable of better choices, but that she wasted her chance with me." Sarah laughed, but she crossed to him and bent to kiss him softly. "You're a complicated man, Daniel Cooper, but I love you anyway. Even though I'm still in this wheelchair?" The question was half joking, but there was genuine vulnerability beneath it. "Especially because you're in that wheelchair," Sarah replied seriously. "It means you know what real adversity looks like, but you chose to rise above it rather than let it define you. That's the man I fell in love with. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, but the man who faced the worst betrayal imaginable and chose mercy over destruction." Daniel pulled her into his lap, but his expression had grown thoughtful. "I destroyed Jessica's career, her reputation, her future. I'm not sure that counts as mercy." "You gave her $500,000 when you could have taken everything," Sarah countered. "You could have made sure she never worked again, never recovered. But you gave her a chance to rebuild. That's mercy, Daniel, but I think you did it as much for yourself as for her. Revenge is exhausting, but forgiveness, even partial forgiveness, is liberating." She was right, but Daniel had learned that lesson slowly, painfully, over years of therapy and self-reflection. The public revelation had been necessary, the exposure of Richard's crimes had been justice, but the continued punishment of Jessica had been cruelty, but he'd eventually recognized the difference. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if she'd passed your test?" Sarah asked quietly. Daniel considered the question carefully, but his answer was honest. "Yes, but I've concluded that our marriage was doomed from the beginning. I married her for the wrong reasons. I was attracted to her beauty, her ambition, but I never really knew her as a person. I was so focused on building my empire, on hiding my success, but I never built a real foundation with her. The test was just my way of confirming what I already suspected. We weren't right for each other, but I needed her to be the one to prove it." "That's remarkably self-aware," Sarah said, but her expression was approving. "Most people would just blame their ex and move on." "I blamed her for years," Daniel admitted, but his smile was rueful. "But therapy helped me see that I played a role in our failure. Not the biggest role. She made her choices, but I created an environment where those choices seemed rational to her. I can't change the past, but I can learn from it." Sarah kissed him again, but this time it was deeper, more passionate. "That's why I said yes when you proposed, but I also said yes because you asked me honestly, without games or tests. You told me about your wealth from the beginning, but you also made sure I knew you'd be the same person if I took it all away. That's real trust, Daniel, but it's also real love." Daniel pulled her closer, but his heart was full in a way it had never been with Jessica. This was what partnership felt like. Not transaction, not manipulation, but genuine connection between two people who chose each other freely, honestly, but without reservation. The phone on his desk buzzed, but Daniel ignored it. Whatever business crisis needed his attention could wait. But this moment with Sarah, this perfect, honest moment, was too precious to interrupt. Outside his windows, the city spread to the horizon like a kingdom he'd conquered. But Daniel had learned that real victory wasn't measured in buildings or bank accounts. Real victory was finding someone who saw past the wealth and the power to the man beneath, but who chose that man anyway. Wheelchair, scars, complicated past, and all. Jessica had taught him what betrayal felt like, but Sarah was teaching him what real love looked like. One had been necessary to appreciate the other, but Daniel wouldn't trade the lessons he'd learned for anything. The phoenix had risen from the ashes, but it had been transformed by the fire rather than merely surviving it. And that transformation, painful as it had been, was the real story worth telling. As Sarah settled into his lap and began discussing their upcoming wedding, a small, intimate affair with just close friends and family, but no media circus or public spectacle, Daniel found himself genuinely happy for the first time in years. He'd been tested by fire and betrayal, but he'd emerged stronger, wiser, but most importantly capable of real love rather than the shallow transaction he'd mistaken for it in his marriage to Jessica. And somewhere, in a small town 3 states away, Jessica Martinez wore a small diamond on a chain around her neck, but she carried the weight of her choices in her heart. She'd lost everything to learn a lesson she should have known all along. Real treasure isn't found in bank accounts or luxury apartments, but in the loyalty and character of the people we choose to love. She'd had a treasure beyond price, but she'd thrown it away for fool's gold. Now she lived with that choice every day, but the lesson had been carved into her soul with such precision that she would carry it to her grave. That was the real ending, not revenge or redemption, but the quiet acceptance of consequences that couldn't be undone. Some mistakes are too big to fix, but they can still teach lessons worth learning, but those lessons come at a price higher than most people are willing to pay. Jessica had paid that price in full, but the receipt was written in regret that would never fade. And Daniel, he'd moved forward, built a new life, but he carried his own scars from the betrayal. He was happy now, genuinely happy, but the shadow of what had happened would always be part of him, a reminder that trust once broken can never be fully restored. Both of them had been changed by what happened, but only one of them had the chance to build something new from the ruins. Daniel had seized that chance with both hands, but Jessica would spend the rest of her life looking back at what she'd lost. That was the final lesson, the ultimate truth that neither of them could escape. Actions have consequences, but betrayal leaves scars that never fully heal. Love can be rebuilt, but not with the same people, not in the same way. But perhaps that was the point. Sometimes the only way forward is to burn everything down and start again from the ashes, but only the strongest survive the fire strong enough to build something better. Daniel Cooper was one of those people, but Jessica Martinez was not. And that difference, more than anything else, explained why one of them was happy and the other was haunted.